I'd like to now quickly introduce the very first speaker. First speaker, Dr. Mark Bailey. He joined the Royal Australian Navy in 1979 as a seaman officer, and he served at sea and ashore in a variety of both permanent and naval reserve postings for over 4 decades. Mark's worked in strategic, logistics, law enforcement, intelligence, counter-terrorism, and strategic government industry liaison roles in that time. But in addition to that, Mark has published a range of different studies, earned his PhD on the way. He's also a fellow at the moment of the Australian Defence Force Academy Naval Studies Group. Finally, Mark is also the liaison between the US Navy War College and the King's College project, looking at, I guess, the pin-up strategist of naval strategy, Admiral Corbett. The project is called Corbett 100. He's really well qualified to speak on our topic this evening. Welcome to the podium, Mark Bailey. Thank you.
Good day to all attendees. It's actually a great honour to be here in very many ways. Firstly, because although I have served in both the Navy and have served in the Air Force as well, I'm Navy, Air Force, Navy. I did not serve with the Army, however I've served with the Army, including Colonel Neil James over there. So I'm a member of the Australian Naval Studies Group at the Defence Force Academy, and I'm also still a reserve officer in the Maritime Trade Operations branch. As mentioned, I'm the Australian end of the Corbett 100 project, and we've just finished our 4 international conferences, the last one being last December at the École Navale in Brest in France. So I'm a maritime trade protection guy. My supervisor keeps telling me, you've got to tell them you're the best in the world, and then he sort of giggles and says that's because you're only the second guy dumb enough to do a PhD in protection of maritime trade, and Brian Ranft died back in 2003. So when you're alone in your field, I guess you can say that, but it does make him laugh. So looking at maritime trade, it's an almost unexplored field. Australia is an island. Australia is amongst one of the most sea-blind countries in the world. We've had a lot of conversations over many, many decades with this. Maritime trade melds trade, economic, military, political and geostrategic history. There's also nothing new under the sun. The whole point is to look at the island nation, how it uses sea power, and this is something that weirds people out. Armies are an integral part of that picture because it isn't about navies. Probably the only people I get hate mail from are navalists who really focus on ships and planes and ships. No, it's about a system of systems. This is a very complex arrangement. I'm mentioning this because this is a strategic basis. This is what Australia was formed on. Prior to World War I, when we formed a navy, each of the colonies had its own little army. Fine, no problem. And let's see if we can get this to go to the next slide. And because of them, land forces were really quite embedded in the Australian colonial culture pre-Federation. They really tried to change that post-Federation with the formation of the RAM. There was actually a movie made about HIMARS Australia, the Indefatigable class battlecruiser, when she arrived. So what we're looking at here is in a couple of parts, and it's quite a cavalry charge through this entire subject because it's enormous. As Peter and I both agree, I think we could spend days talking about this and really not get much past the surface of the waters. So, in 1914, Australia was a primary producer. It had almost no industry. How did we get from that to this? Well, the answer to that is actually quite complex, and it involved, I think, the single most successful application of effective governance in Australia's history. So this is what we're going to charge through. First thing, perceptions and questions. Perceptions are really, really important. We all perceive the world in a certain way. So when we look at current troubles in the Middle East, the perceptive lens that most people in Australia will use is that of their own view of the world. As a counter-terrorism guy, for 14 years of my life. Let me tell you something. The perceptive lens of the people from that part of the world is entirely different. And the perceptive lens of a member of Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or one of those groups is entirely different again. There's a lot of people here who've served in the Middle East, and I've seen some, slight nods on that one. It's a different way of looking at the world. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at what triggered Australia's mobilisation in the 30s, how well positioned we were, and the work of Dr. Andrew Ross in this area is phenomenal. If you're interested in mobilisation, please read either his book Armed and Ready, which was done in '98, or The Great Power Struggle for Australia, 2 volumes, well worth buying. So we're going to run through this. I don't think the people up the back can read that, so I'm going to do a bit of PowerPoint for the blind. My apologies. We'll look at war material manufacturing, how the Commonwealth Government managed its strategic narrative in the 1930s, and then the outcomes. This might get a little controversial and contentious, but I'm retired. They can take my birthday off me if they want. Firstly, we ran a bipartisan national industrialisation program from 1919 to 1939, and it was incredibly successful. So successful that when you look at the plan the Japanese Army came up with to put 2 area armies ashore at Port Stephens no earlier than July 1942, had they landed, they wouldn't have been defeated, they would have been annihilated, and that's just by the AMF. And the AIF was also back by then. So what they did worked, and we'll run through some of the details of that. We'll have a quick look at the 1939 War Book, how that was developed, good points, bad points, why it didn't work, why industry really did work. Then have a quick squiz at the lessons learned, and for one of the very rare times I've ever spoken, I'm actually going to use some props, and there's a reason for that. And finally, the implications for Australia. Let's look at worldviews. This is how Australia viewed the world all through the 1920s and 30s. Now, this is obviously from 1912, it's from the Board of Trade, or on the 1st of January that year. Every merchant ship, British merchant ship, reported its position, and they plotted it and said, here's where all our ships are. Europe's empty because that was a separate diagram, which is black with ships. What you can see here is the structure of imperial and therefore global trade. Australia's way down here in the corner, really, really remote. You've got the main line of the Iron Highway still existing, that still runs. You've got the Indian trade here. The South American grain trades are building up. You can see a lot of grain being moved up there. Pretty much a logistics highway across the North Atlantic. But that is the view of the world that Australians shared, and everybody shared, up until very recently. It's wrong. For us, it's wrong. So I went to AGO, I think they are now, and said, please make this for me. That's Australia's world. That's where we live. We don't live in a corner of the Pacific, down there in the corner remote from everybody. We're smack bang in the middle of the world ocean. There is no difference, there are no barriers between the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean and the Southern Ocean. Now, I've adapted this particular one to show you the structure of the empire. It had 2 heartlands, the demographic and trade heartland here. That's why they had to dominate the Indian Ocean. And here, across the North Atlantic, the industrial heartland. So this is the world interpreted through a modern lens that Australia's strategic structure was built on back in the 1930s. On the modern map, those are AIS tracks, so that's merchant ship densities. And interestingly enough, as a very small aside, all these little yellow blotches you'll see all over the place, Chinese fishing fleets. Please understand that gives them an enormous strategic advantage. But back to this era. So here we are, Australia, in the middle of this whacking great world ocean. We're dependent on trade coming through this route, because that's where all our equipment comes from, and most of our industrial goods, and that's our major trading partner. We don't do much trade up here to the north, but we've got a strategic threat developing here, thanks to our good friends, the Americans, who in 1922, as part of the Washington Naval Treaty, one of the the consequences they inflicted there was the end of the Anglo-Japanese military alliance. Now, for the first time, that exposed Australia to a local strategic risk from a great power. And there's nothing new in history. Have a look at the threat axis. So what did they do? The world being an ocean, the overwhelming use of the oceans are commercial. And navies, that second point, boy, this is why I get hate mail from navalists. You know, the Navy is a second order effect of commercial use of the sea. So what they started to do in the 1930s was go, oops, the Japanese are looking like a serious threat. We're building up this industry. The entire point of building up secondary industry in Australia from 1919 onwards, as a lesson of World War I, was aimed specifically and strategically against the Empire of Japan. Full stop. There is no argument about this. It's in the archival records, and it was a coherent strategic decision, policy decision, which applied across all of the political parties. Nobody failed to support it, even during the Depression. So with all of these, and yes, I've got to, as a Corbettian, I've got to say that Australia's got to have a Corbettian view of the world. All that means is that, hey, fellas, you're dependent on the ocean. Australia does not survive without maritime trade. The Army has a huge role to play in that. And with the allocation of long-range fires to Army, it just got a lot bigger. Think of it as really long-range coast defence. However, as a result of World War I, with the Australian popular experience being soldiers in the field and every family losing somebody, Australia, as did Britain, did not understand this. So essentially, Australia turned itself culturally into a continental power, which is interesting when you look at the map and realise we're an island. But the Brits did the same thing. And by the way, the Japanese did too. So what's the threat? This is the view from North Asia. You're looking out there and you've got all this very large ocean around you. And yeah, the main threat to Japan is over there to the right. It's the Chinese. That's where they've taken Korea, and they're getting very interested in Manchuria. So in 1935, the strategic breakpoint, September 1931. 1929, we brought in the 10-year rule. No strategic threat to the empire in Asia or anywhere else for 10 years, because nobody can move an army overseas without us knowing about it and getting at least 10 years warning time. September 1931, the Japanese moved 2 area armies to Manchuria, and nobody had a clue until there were boots on the ground in Manchuria itself. They didn't come out of Korea, they came ashore over the beaches and at the ports. At that point, the Australian government panicked, because this is the strategic situation they're facing. The Japanese are going, yeah, we've got a close area here, we're going to dominate that. That's why we're invading Manchuria, and later on in 1937, obviously China. By the way, the Japanese attack, amphibious landing at Shanghai in 1937, was the largest and furthest amphibious operation ever conducted. They were not slouches. They built specialised vessels. They invented the LST, for example. But here's the Japanese view. This area is our resource area. It's the near area. We have to either seize it or dispute it. Above all else, we must be able to exploit it. We've got a forward position out in the mandates. That's a huge strategic advantage, because that keeps the Americans a long way away, and it really does neutralise the British Empire's strategic depth, because the Empire's strategic depth was Australia. And this is the nightmare we eventually faced. So this is all strategic background as to World War II. They saw this coming. We knew the Japanese were very far from friendly. We got into a trade war with them in 1936, and they beat the living daylights out of us. As in, all Australian trade with Japan was stopped, and we had to scramble to find extra markets. We had to scramble to find extra sources of materials as well. What was supposed to prevent this happen was the Singapore strategy. Now, what was it? Perceptive lenses again. We view the Singapore strategy through the disaster of 1942. That was just the fall of the base. The Singapore strategy succeeded. What was it? It was a global oil fuel bunkering program, because the Royal Navy before World War I depended on coal. They had the world's largest global coaling network. Oops, we're moving to oil. We have to replace it with oil, 14 million tonnes of it. That's very expensive. And Australia's role in that, we had to store about, I think it was 445,000 tonnes of oil. We didn't have a single oil tank in Australia when that policy came out. But what it did do, even though they did lose the base, we did lose Malaya, we did lose 8th Division, what it did do was it returned global mobility to the Royal Navy, which was a one-hemisphere navy protecting a two-hemisphere empire. Does that sound familiar to what's happening in the world right now? Because it should. Nothing is new under the sun. How exposed was Australia in this circumstance in 1942? Medium to medium high level threat across the north, lots of air raids and things like that. But in all honesty, they were spoiling attacks to stop us from launching counterattacks up to the north. The worst part of it, and the part which really hurt, was the medium-low level threat from Japanese submarine operations, where they ran 2 anti-trade campaigns against the Australian east coast and badly damaged our economy, as in the steel works starts to cut back production of steel because of the 5 dedicated iron ore carriers in the Australian merchant fleet. They sank 3 of them. There were very serious economic impacts from that. All right, the dreaded M word. I can now use it as I no longer work in Navy headquarters. It's a very new thing. The Roman Empire could not mobilise. These were low production societies. The important thing about this particular chart is the war-making capacity. This little blue dotted line here. Look where it takes off. It only takes off at about 1800. What happened in 1820? The start of the first globalisation. Why did the first globalisation kick off then? Because the British started industrialising about 1750. This enabled the development of high productivity societies. The Roman Empire and every other empire out there had about a 2% tops excess of production over what they needed just to keep themselves alive. And that's why 80% of the population of these empires were out there in the fields growing stuff. What percent of the Australian population, and we're the 3rd largest exporter of food on the planet by tonnage, what percentage of the Australian population produces that agricultural excess? How many agricultural workers we got?
5%?
Down? Yeah, it's about 3%, 2.5% to 3%, depending on how you measure it. That's never happened before. And that's why you get this massive increase in everything from life expectancy, people not living in extreme poverty, all of that sort of thing. And it all happens as a result of the first and second globalisations. First globalisation ends in August 1914. Second one kicks off around about 1960. Sorry, got to run some maritime trade stuff past you. All right, maritime trade and sea supply. Maritime trade, everyone does it. That's what keeps everyone happy, prosperous, and using imported electronics. There's a part of it called sea supply. I had this discussion with Mick Noonan back when he was Chief of Navy, and he said, I really want you to start writing some stuff on this and start to define what I mean by it, because it's his term, not mine. I just defined it for him. So sea supply is that part of maritime trade without which you lose the war, without which you cannot fight. If it's maintained, you can prosecute a war, and you can't be defeated if you're an island state. If we maintain sea supply onto this continent, then we cannot be invaded, we cannot be defeated. I would point out to you that that's the number one job of responsibility of the ADF and government. If it's disrupted, you can probably prosecute a defensive war. You might be forced to come to terms, but that just means you've been knocked out of a conflict. If it's degraded, you're surrendering. Another very interesting chart. I'm sorry to rely so much on these, but it's a data-dense way of showing outcomes. Have a little look at that green line in between the two vertical bars. That's the effect of the Australian government's policy from 1919 until 1940, 45 in that case, of building up secondary industry. That's the increase in manpower in Australian secondary industries. That is success. That is a massively successful piece of Australian governance, one of the best we've ever done. By the way, the very first thing they kicked off on was we need the cheapest possible electricity and we need to start building statewide electrical grids. At the moment we've lost that, and that's why we're deindustrialising. So they succeed during the war, they get very complacent during this period. Then during the period of the second globalisation, along come the economic rationalists and Australia has deindustrialised. Please notice that in terms of people working in a secondary industry, as a percentage of population, we are now basically worse off than we were before World War I. This is a massive strategic failure, and it's a failure of Australian governance, all of them, governments and governance, all of them, since around about 1970. This was the response we saw in the 30s. So, they've brought in policies, they're building up secondary industry, it's working really well, they're doing it for import replacement. Yes, they are using tariff walls deliberately to preserve some of these industries. The British hated this, by the way. When we started producing mining machinery in this country, the British industry was absolutely screaming about it because we put a 50% tariff on imported machinery, specifically to obtain a strategic advantage. Why? Because if you're building heavy mining machinery, you can build turbines, you can build guns, you can build artillery pieces. You've got a very, very large supply of machine tools, and you've got the people trained to use them. That's why they did it. They took those arguments to the British through the Committee of Imperial Defence, and they said, yeah, look, fellas, we understand completely, and we're still going to castigate you because the government has told us we must because the industry's screaming that they're losing their export market. So none of this is politically easy, and please don't think that it is. But this looks very interesting. I did a comparison here from FY 2018-19 versus FY 32-33. What you see, and remember, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. There is no money. So what do they do in the first year after the Manchurian crisis of September 1931, which is the precursor to that financial year, which is why I picked it. Oh, and why did I pick that? Because that's when it became obvious that the Chinese were conducting hybrid warfare against us, obvious to government, not to we who had been watching the situation. Okay, so we've got no money, but planning is cheap. Start to do all your planning for when we get money. Mobilisation planning. Start that right now. Start inventorying what is actually at Lithgow. Not so much the machines, that's easy. What about skilled people? How many machinists have we got? What can we actually do in terms of expanding that production of small arms and artillery and whatnot when we get the money to do so? There's a 20% increase the next year. We couldn't afford that. But they went from £5 million to £6 million, which is a very large increase in 1 year. And they did it through cutting back programs which were very politically sensitive. It was a politically courageous decision to do that. They start ordering the first sloops. If you have a look at this in 2019 to 2020, bit of a decline. And that's pretty much all the way through that. I'm not going to pay much attention to this. Also in FY 33-34, as Peter will show, they're really starting to put some long-term orders in for artillery. They're looking at things like, what do we replace the 18-pounder with? What's the 25-pounder? What machinery do we need to do that? And they're starting to put in early orders, the long-term stuff, for some of that gear. 17% increase in expenditure next year. They order the first cruiser. 14%, 12.5%. And finally, as a result of the the Munich crisis, a 55% increase. By this time, the services were saying to government, don't give us any more money, we can't spend it. Now, there was a serious strategic failure here too in September 1937. The Imperial Conference, the Australian delegation over there, with authority from the Australian government that we would raise taxes if the British said we needed to purchase and fund one or two capital ships, plus a raft of other things relating to specialist equipment for army. Mostly in terms of ships to move stuff, because ammunition, for example, is a very awkward and difficult cargo to move. I know I've done it, and moving ammo is no fun at all. And the British said, no, we're all cool, no problem, you don't need to do that. One of the major strategic failures of the Committee of Imperial Defence. Applying the lessons post-war. The 1939 Commonwealth War Book was a limited or qualified success. Problem, they didn't have an understanding of industry, and here I'm going to use some props. What really did work was saying, all right, we've got a problem, we've fluffed it. Essington Lewis and Mr. Hartnett, our leading industrialists, come in, you become the ministers responsible, essentially, and you run this because you understand industry. That's the critical lesson that was learned from World War II. Applying these post-war, I managed to find and have reprinted the Commonwealth War Book, so that's now in the National Library and the ADFA Library in both hard and soft copy. That's the 1956 War Book. It's an extremely successful thing, but it was absolutely worthless without that. So in 1947, they go, all right, just finished a war. What are the lessons? How do we codify them? Everyone's been writing everything up. All of your lessons learned from everything you did. Fine, splendid. Before we write a war book, we've got to do a complete inventory, and this is called the Structure and Capacity of Australian Manufacturing Industries. 1952. It took them 4 years to do it. We have not even attempted to start such a thing in Australia now. Until then, you can't, it's the big lesson of the 1939 War Book, until you actually do a full audit, a national industrial audit, and understand what industrial capacity you have, you can't mobilise. I'll stress that again. You can't mobilise, even if you want to. We've also been very, very good at throwing our lessons away. So, this is volume 2 of The Control of Manpower in Australia, a manuscript for part 2 prepared by Mr. M.A. Bland. It's the only copy in existence from the Control of Manpower Directorate. I got that out of a dumpster. It was being tossed. But a lot of this stuff is still out there. I rarely use props, but I really wanted to use that one to show that the lessons are there. It's all in the archives, and we've been way too busy throwing stuff away. So applying it, they do the National Industrial Audit, and then they write the War Book after that, because now they've got the understanding of industry. And the result is that we keep heavy industry cores like Cockatoo well into the 80s. Applying the lessons now. I've got to be a little bit careful here because I was involved in experimentation out of Navy strategic policy and plans from 2019 to 2024. But broad lessons I can bring here. None of the post-war lessons were studied, and they were not studied either by the Directorate of Mobilisation. All of the policy outcomes that were developed during that era have been abandoned since, starting around about 1965. In 2019, Defence started looking at mobilisation and did the one thing that a bunch of us advised them not to, and that was they took it to contractors. The contractors did very well. I haven't seen any actual results from that yet, but maybe someday. There are some very thick reports which I do believe hold open many a door. It's got to be defence-led, it's got to be whole of government. Defence leads to a certain point and then the Department of Industry takes over. End of story. We're not there yet. Conclusion. We still think continentally. I was involved personally in all of the experimentation which have redefined the role of the Army for today. Army's got long-range fires and littoral manoeuvre and is building a fleet of LSTs. And I served on Tobruk. The big ones, they're bigger than her. These are not unimpressive assets, but they are sea power assets. The Army is a sea power force for an island nation. I know what Army's job is going to be as a result of that experimentation, and a big part of it, as with all three services, is making sure that the homeland is secure. But there's other parts of it that are, shall we say, a little more offshore, and I can say that because the contracts for the LSTs were let, I believe, last month, sir? So Army's moving in a very different way now, and all of the lessons are there. Army is now looking, I know from talking with Army headquarters people, at how the US Marine Corps is going to operate in this theatre. The US Marine Corps, interestingly enough, is looking at how the Japanese Imperial Naval Special Naval Landing Forces operated in this theatre in 41, 42, because that's really interesting and applicable to our strategic opponent. So, the current behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party shows us a couple of things. Firstly, nothing's new under the sun. We've faced this threat before. We've faced this threat on the same threat axis before. Strategically, we have much more depth than we had in 1941. Why? Because the Chinese are not in the mandates. Well, now the Central Pacific nations like the Federated States of Micronesia. But they're trying very, very hard to get there. Very hard indeed. So, with this, basic necessities. I picked this one and I changed this last night. That's the position on the 8th of March 2026 of every tanker carrying crude out of the Gulf. And we've all seen in our pocketbooks the results of a minor disruption of that. Should something much bigger kick off to our north, it will make that look like a tea party.
On our subject matter expert panel, Major General Jason Blaine, DSC, AMCSC, is the head of Land Systems Division in Defence. Jason has had a distinguished military career spanning over 3 decades, and he's served on multiple overseas operational deployments, including one we shared together, and also in an array of both command and staff appointments, including as the commander of the 7th Australian Brigade. Jason's also a graduate of the Australian Command and Staff College and the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies. He's also a member of the Melbourne Legacy Director of the board here down in Victoria, and which is obviously a very important part to us, our Victorian members who are joining here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll pass over to my colleague, Lieutenant Colonel James Ealing, who will moderate the panel for us this evening. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Nick. Well, I think we've had 2 really fascinating presentations today, because when you look at the history of the Second World War and Australia's participation in it, you actually look at the end of the process, where it was certainly a lot clunkier than the picture that you were painting. So it's really interesting to dig into how well the actual industrial mobilisation went to what actually happened on the battlefield for the soldiers. But sir, did you want to start off with a couple of comments about what you're thinking?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, first of all, thanks for the invitation. And when Rob Crawford reached out and Nick to talk about what you were doing here, I was really taken by it, because these are really important elements of how we understand ourselves and understanding history, obviously, so that we can prepare ourselves for the task that we do have now. And I say that because this corps particularly, and what the Royal Australian Artillery are going through, is the most profound change, I think, across our Army's history, and indeed across the corps that I have served with. What we see today in the regiments of the Royal Australian Artillery are very different to only 2 or 3 years ago. And some of the photos you would have seen on the slides of that is demonstrated through things like long-range fires, as Mark talked about. Not just long-range fires, but land-based maritime strike in those long-range fires. where the Australian Army is in the long-range missile age, being able to reach out and deny adversaries at distance. I was present last year when we fired in Australia for the first time a PRISM missile out of a HIMARS north of 300 kilometres onto a target at pinpoint accuracy. A live shot warhead, very interesting that we were planning that, to do that, ensuring that we had everything in place, because the Americans hadn't done many of those shoots as well. And my great friends within the artillery were obviously instrumental in that activity, particularly the CO of the regiment when he yelled out splash while we were watching the screen at Mount Bundy, having seen the missile go to Bradshaw, a long way away. Splash for me as an infantryman is like 3 to 4 seconds max. Actually, it was like 30 seconds. And you can imagine we were all a bit worried that we had not seen the missile. It had gone somewhere else. But it was dead on target, that PRISM missile. You look at what's coming in now, just down the road at Avalon, with the Hanwha facility, the HACE, building the AS9 self-propelled howitzer. First of those being delivered as we speak, the first 3 of those built in Australia. Having it manufactured for the first time, armoured vehicle systems in Tasmania, having our steel bent and welded by Elphinstone, having those hulls and turrets come to Geelong, and then having the manufacturing of those vehicles, which will soon be alongside our infantry fighting vehicles. But the artillery now in the self-propelled artillery area again, a long number of years since they were there. You then look at the capabilities within our integrated air missile defences, particularly our short-range ground-based air defence with NASAM missiles at 16 Regiment. Again, a fundamental change to our air defence capabilities. Then look at the UAS capabilities within artillery, providing us that medium level of uncrewed aerial systems and the reconnaissance ability of that, as well as maintaining our towed artillery. So with our 155 M777s, a wide range of roles. Now I must say, as infantryman, I was also a mortarman. I was the platoon commander of 6 RAR's mortar platoon, so I think I know a lot about artillery, which I'll be proven wrong. But the mortars was much more of an area weapon. Now, I say that because this is happening at pace. It's coming into the Australian Army at pace, and the Army has repostured and restructured around the National Defence Strategy that is bringing capability in. Again, my whole career has been about fires, the artillery particularly, supporting manoeuvre. And now it's about manoeuvre supporting fires. And as we're able to project ourselves into the region, being able to conduct long-range fires, land-based maritime strike, the role of the combined arms fighting system, things like infantry fighting vehicles, M1A2 tanks, our combat reconnaissance vehicle, the Boxer, supported by our combat engineer vehicles and our close combat aviation, is really about how we actually allow ourselves to be postured to conduct long-range fire, long-range strike. So that's a change, a fundamental change to the way we see the role of the Army and the way that we have therefore repostured Army within 18 months. And when I was a more junior officer and we're going into the Bereshiba model, for some of you that might remember that, where we had 3 like-for-like brigades being modelled to support our operations in the Middle East, particularly that ready and reset cycle. We had 3 like-for-like brigades. It took a long time to get there, and we obviously did. We have changed in 18 months what would probably have taken 9 years if we didn't have the urgency to do it. So the Artillery Corps is leading that push. So thanks, great to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So for the panel, what lessons for today's military and political decision makers can be drawn from Australia's World War II challenges in defending the nation and the global support network? And thinking, I think it was you, Mark, talked about a coherent strategic decision that was made for the preparation for the industrial mobilisation. What are the things that are different today, and what are the things that we can take out of that period, the pre-war period,
that are relevant for today?
I guess I'll kick off on that one then. Coherence, the coherent strategic decision to build up Australia's secondary industry after World War I was based on a very clear understanding of the strategic environment. Now, at that time when they made that decision, Japan was an ally, and Japan had been a very good ally in World War I. Japanese ships escorted Australian troop ships. But who was the only possible strategic threat to Australia? Japan. Are Japanese strategic intents starting to vary from those of the British Empire's strategic intents? Yes, they are. Therefore, that is a long-term strategic threat. They actually thought in 1919 that the Anglo-Japanese alliance was going to be renewed in 1921 until 1931. So they were planning a strategic, a coherent strategic national industrialisation policy to deal from 1919 with the mid to late 1930s. Now that required very good understanding of their strategic environment. Now we do understand our current strategic environment. We have wasted our 10 years of warning time, and there is still very... I'm retired, I can say whatever the hell I want.
Please do.
The Australian government's response to this over the last 10 years has been abysmal. So they understand the problem and are utterly unwilling to deal with it. That's the big difference from now, between now and 1919.
Betty, did you want to?
Oh, why not? So with that preparation for war, Mark's right, that sort of grand strategy across the 20s, the 20s and 30s was remarkable, if you like. I'd just like to think about just before the war, when the decision was made to expand the industrial base, or the defence industrial base, if you like. And I've looked at the Australian efforts, the UK efforts, and the American efforts as far as time goes. And surprisingly enough, because it was the second industrial revolution and the manufacturing type was all the same, each three countries pretty much followed a similar pattern and took about the same time, because there's only 24 hours in a day. So they each took about 3 years to think about things, find the money, design the new buildings, get the stuff organised, and about 2 to 3 years to then implement, actually build the factories, and then, which at the end of that 2 or 3 years, they were at maximum rate production. So it took between 5 and 6 years of actually getting your factories up and running. We think about today with that facility that they're building for naval strike missile, which I think the Army gets those Navy strike missiles or something.
Army will get PRISM. Yeah.
Oh, we'll get PRISM. Okay, good point. Very critical. Yes, right. But the naval strike missiles, that building that factory at Newcastle is similarly taking about 5 or 6 years. And equally, building the rockets for the HIMARS system in Australia is similarly taking about 5 or 6 years. It takes time. It takes time today to think about, find the money, design, build things. It did back in 1938 as well. And the second thing was, you'll notice when I skip through the middle there, and important thing about intellectual property. So the advantage of having that government organisation was that the government owned the intellectual property. So the arms that we have today are bought from private companies, often in the United States. And so accessing their intellectual property can be difficult. So if there's one thing that I would learn from those days to bring forward to now, is to get that intellectual property now and have it on the shelf somehow, just the off chance you need it. Because American companies are not fast at moving with legal issues sort of like this. So I'd sort of press for better intellectual property access.
Mm-hmm. I'll reinforce something Peter said there. High tech is high tech. There's no difference in lead times. High tech in 1939 is no different in terms of industrial capacity, need to train people, buildings, power supplies, than today. High tech is high tech. And it really, there's no difference across historical timelines.
I agree to a certain extent. The complexity of some of these systems and the integration of communication systems, particularly around that as well, as you look at the size of that, and the cyber threats that are associated with those types of digital systems, puts another dilemma onto you, right? So, while we say the nature of war is constant and the character changes, I think the character of war between what we saw leading into World War II and at World War II is different to the character of war now. You just have a look right now what we see in Ukraine, what we're seeing in the Middle East play out. So we have to understand that. But I agree, the nature of the technology would have been complex enough at the time as well. It just has added to us another layer of complexity that we need to consider. I think, really we're looking at the history of what you see back going into World War II. It's quite interesting to look at how much the government had moved into supporting building these annexes, right? These shadow industries. I think we can read, and I'm a good, infantry officer. I know the rule. Obviously professionals talk logistics and amateurs talk tactics, and I've just become a professional by being in this job. We were oversupplied by those annexes. That was a deliberate, system. Look at the US, and if you read Freedom's Forge, going into World War II, there was no political appetite for building up the defence industries. There was very little, any support from at least the government level. It was all done by industrialists who were willing to take risk and were able to look ahead and see where the world may be going, and then stepping into that space by and being able to pivot industries. And I think that's probably the critical thing is we look now at our landscape and understand what are the industries that we do have, and it's a good point, I think, maybe you raised it, Mark and Peter, but understanding what the industrial base looks like. And the National Support Division, that's created within Defence has a role to do that, to understand what we can do from a sovereign perspective, what we need from a sort of a assurance in a overseas perspective, but understanding what you can pivot to is really critical, and that's what was the US success. They were able to pivot a lot of their industries to war fighting. I also now look at, and I might go to your next question a little bit, but I haven't jumped ahead, but what do we know in regard to a strategy? I grew up in an army, like many of you in this room, where we were really an army to do a broad range of tasks, right? We had to do everything from humanitarian disaster relief through to, peacekeeping operations through to high-end war fighting. So, we definitely were a force that was trying to be jack of all trades. This is now based on the National Defence Strategy with an investment program that is aligned to it, is about being a focused force. And for the Army, it goes back to my opening monologue about what we are doing in regards to our ability to conduct littoral manoeuvre to support that long-range fire effect. Being a focused force at times is good because it really drives where the investment priorities go. And interesting, in your presentation, Army didn't know how to spend their money, right? I bet in those days, didn't know where to spend its money. But we have been very much clear-eyed about where the priority goes. I think there's a bit of strength in that. I think that's what you've got to do when you're actually making sure every dollar counts.
So, you, Peter, mentioned briefly the issues with the engines for the Beaufort bombers, which came about because we didn't use the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. We got the railway sheds to do that, and they were used to building
locomotives,
and the tolerances were a lot finer for an aircraft engine. Who would have thought? But that was what created a lot of the issues that we had there. So, sir, I agree with you. We've got a lot of integrated circuits. There's the communications component. What are the challenges going to be moving forward that are going to be new, given the fact that a lot of we're aiming for sovereign manufacturing capability, which means sovereign availability of the raw materials. We need the ability of the skills of the people who are going to do that, and those skill sets don't come quickly. And the complexity of the platforms that we're putting together. An aircraft, and I think in some respects, an aircraft is it was incredibly complex for Australian manufacturing to do back then. But it kind of feels like it's an order of magnitude more than it is today, with the complexity of what it is that we're trying to manufacture.
Look, it's a supply chain issue. We are in a global market that is trying to access, everybody's trying to access the same scarce resources at times. Obviously, a room full of artillery officers, you've probably all got BMWs because, that's how much you get paid. But remember back in COVID, right, when we ran out of chips and BMWs were being produced without, head-up displays, there was issues about the length of time to get a vehicle in. I remember speaking to my German colleagues when I got into this job, and BMW itself went and bought as many washing machines as they could just to take the chips out so they could actually utilise that in their vehicles. We are in a market where we are trying to compete for those resources as well. So that's a risk, but it's also opportunity. The fact is that a global supply chain is also about global production. Hanwha is building armoured fighting vehicles here in Australia. First time they've moved off the Korean Peninsula to do such an activity because they want depth in their global supply chain. We're building Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicles in Australia for the German army, so to export them back to Germany, again, utilising the global supply chain. So that's a part of it, right? I think it's about how you then assure those global supply chains, which is the critical thing. What is a sovereign capability requirement? How do you ensure you've got what you need to maintain the capabilities that you're actually building? We haven't built vehicles for a while, right? We've now got sort of lots of their expertise, but this town alone, the number of people employed in my division who were in Ford and bringing that technology, that design, engineering design, skills into what we're doing today in armoured fighting vehicles is absolutely apparent, right? We've got that skill set still there. So we're producing vehicles in Bendigo, producing vehicles here in Geelong and up in Brisbane. We've got to continue looking at how we can support that, maintain that, and that's why we are so focused on in our Defence Industry Development Strategy, the DIDS, if I could mention that to you. The DIDS is aligned to our investment program, but it's how we go after sovereign industry priorities. What are the priority areas? The one that I'm responsible with Owen, who's here from Owen runs our long-range fires program, so that's why HIMARS can fire prisoners, because of Owen and his team. We are focused on the land combined arms fighting system. That is obviously shaped towards the littoral manoeuvre. We've got to look at export opportunities so we can continue getting scale. And it's all about scale. You need to get numbers to make it for industry, ability to lower price, increase workforce, and maintain scale. So that's a challenge, right? You've got to continue looking at opportunities to support industry in that regard. I think overall, it's about understanding the market, having market intelligence, having really good understanding about what areas you could pivot, what areas you've got adjacencies on, so where a manufacturer can do other area work now, but you can move them to uplifting their production. We still have a Lithgow small arms capability here. Obviously, TELUS own the Lithgow factory, where we produce our small arms, particularly our F-88s and our F-90s, plus other weapon systems. Maintaining that capability to allow you to ensure that you've got what you think is sovereign requirements is really important.
So the scaling up component, I think small arms, we produced 1.8 billion rounds of small arms ammunition in the Second World War. 8 million rounds of medium artillery, which I'm assuming are 25 pounders, ammunition. So that's a decent fire plan. 5 million grenades, 4 million mortar bombs. So how was that done back then? Oh, and so that is going to be an extant problem. So if you believe the popular press, in the first 3 days of the offensive against Iran, the United States went through 4.5 years worth of supply of Tomahawk missiles. So it'll take them 4.5, at the current rate of manufacturing, it's going to take them 4.5 years to replace that. So that is that really highlights the importance of magazine depth. How did we scale back then? Because these are impressive numbers, 1.8 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Wouldn't have thought that it was that high. You wouldn't have thought the army would have needed that many. How did they do that, and how do we respond to that challenge today?
So there's a couple, pick up on your previous question there about what did they do then that we should learn from. In the first year or so of the war, bear in mind that the military of the time was not necessarily experts in defence industry manufacturing techniques. Okay, they were focused on fighting wars rather than industrial techniques. So while they had a second industrial revolution kind of manufacturing that needed to keep going, and as was just said, you need to keep production lines going and you need to keep them hot, because once you stop them, restarting them again takes you a long time. People, or the military right at the very start of the war, didn't understand about that sort of stop-start nature. You actually needed to keep things rolling on. So I think as far as getting large numbers goes, it's sort of one of those things that you need to keep on building stuff, which also means, of course, that when you want to upgrade something on the production line, that's hard as well, because you might have to stop or change things overnight so that you can keep your mass production going. And of course, the scaling we spoke before was obviously build a whole pile of replicate the factories, if you like. Now, replicating the factories was actually the easy bit. The hard bit was finding the workforce. And you've got to find the workforce, so you take them out of civil society. So when you take them out of civil society, just bear in mind that historically it's been that you can allocate about 10% of the total population, which is about 20% of the workforce, because many of the population are children, obviously, etc. But about 20% of the workforce, you can't take more than that away from society, or else the society starts to fall apart. And as soon as society starts to fall apart, what happens then is the military can't do its business. I'm just curious to see that, with reading some stuff recently about the Finnish winter war, when the Russians are advancing on the sort of out of stage right, was that after a few weeks of complete mobilisation, if you like, they exceeded that 20% margin. They found that the back line was falling apart and had to start demobilising, just as Australia did back in 1943, to demobilise some people to go back to the farms to bring in the bring in the crops. So when you talk about these large numbers, building the factories, think of the workforce as well. And the Lithgow one's a great example in that they built the factory in Lithgow. It's away from Japanese cruisers passing sort of passing city heads and firing shots and stuff like that. Really good. But when you wanted to expand Lithgow, there's no workforce there. They had to start building the little minor things that people need, like places to live, things, sort of places where they can eat, etc., etc., etc. So I'd sort of say something we should learn from World War II as well is to distribute manufacturing around Australia with that workforce in mind. In Toowoomba at the moment, they're building these GoSpat Loyal Wingman vehicles, which are assembled from, because no one makes anything anymore. It's all you're assembling subcomponents made by other people. But nonetheless, you can't rapidly scale up assembly in Toowoomba because there's just not that many people there. So think about distributing defence industry around Australia, not just from a military point of view of protecting it from the bad guys, but just to be where the workforce is.
And there's another part here too. It's understanding a strategic environment. Peter mentioned in 1943, we're pulling people out of the army to go back to the farms. Why? What was Australia's major strategic contribution, grand strategic contribution to World War II? Had nothing to do with the ADF at all. It was the fact that 80% of the calories consumed by the 3 million American sailors, soldiers and airmen west of Hawaii came from Australia. That was our major contribution to World War II. That's why at the end of the war, the Australian government, or the Australian people, were owed money under the Lend-Lease program because food supply was a Lend-Lease thing. You've got to understand the strategic environment before you make some of these decisions. You can still have gaps. In World War II, 1940, fine, we loaded up all the ships with all of the ammunition, gave every ship we had a full ammunition loadout, and that was it. We didn't have anything else. There wasn't another 8-inch shell or 6-inch shell on the continent.
And have to admire the politicians' toughness of the times. So the rations allocated to Australian civilians in 1944 and 45 are amongst the worst or were the worst of the whole war, if you like. So Australian children are going hungry to feed American servicemen. Imagine selling that one today.
The other thing you have to sell, by the way, is that in the event of a major regional conflict today, the Australian population overall will lose at least 1/3 of its standard of living. We lost that in World War I, we lost that in World War II, and there has to be strategic messaging from government that, fellas, if this happens and people, your current standard of living is probably half of what you've currently got, and you're going to have to grin and bear it.
That model you talk about in Australia, I think, is a very prime opportunity for this in regard to how you distribute manufacturing and build up a base. I was fortunate to go across to the US last year and see a few of these areas where they actually are building and manufacturing missiles, HIMARS, tanks, etc. They do those in places that are quite remote. Now, Camden in Kansas is where they build, Arkansas, sorry, is where they build the HIMARS vehicles and the prison missiles. But what they've done in that sort of remote community is they've created an education program and a way of maintaining a population of about 150,000 people who all feed into the factory through jobs, right? So kids go to school and they want to finish school and go work in the factory and make missiles, or go work in the factory and make tanks in places like Anniston. So where you are building local communities but having a way of ensuring you're maintaining a throughput of educated, skilled workforce. It works. Yeah. They've been doing that since World War II. Right.
It's a big lesson for us to learn.
So producing the equipment's one thing, getting it into the hands of the troops is another. There's an oral history of Bob Semple, who was a gunner for the 2nd 12th, and he talks about training in the Middle East, and they mapped out what a 25-pounder looked like on the ground, and they stood in their positions based on the markings in the sand for that gun. We think about the Battle of Kokoda, where at Ishirava there was a company sergeant major who the Bren gunner in front of him falls over. He picks up the Bren, empties the magazine, and then says, "How the bloody hell do you change a magazine on this thing?" That was the last thing that he said. Company sergeant major, he is the expert in the company. He should know everything. They were handed their Brens at Owen's Corner as they were heading up. What were the problems? And so no training. They literally, we talk about a Soldier's 5. He didn't even get the Soldier's 5. What were the problems why were we in RAAF 75 Squadron with the P-40s? They got those P-40s, which were the Tomahawks, which were also called...
Kitty Hawks.
Oh, sorry, Kitty Hawks, yes. But the Tomorrow Hawks or the Never Hawks, because they seem to take a very long time to appear. What were the hold-ups in ensuring that we were ready to arm and train our soldiers and pilots?
Oh, look at me. Sorry. Well, I mean, certainly from the aircraft point of view, of course, it was simply that it was very difficult to buy aeroplanes. Now, bear in mind, before the Japanese attacked, most American support went to the UK. Naturally, there's very little for Australia because there was not a particular need for Australia. Now that 1939 period until late 1941 was very fortunate for Australia from an industrial mobilisation and an army mobilisation sort of point of view, because of course it did give people time to be trained, but it also meant, of course, that people were training on equipment that had not yet arrived, which is probably what would happen in the real world as well. You know, if you want to expand a force, it's got to be pretty hard to give everybody equipment all at the same time. So I will now divert from this completely to make an observation about the future, because someone made it to me yesterday, and so it was hard to get. There were issues about supply. Trains were short. There was a whole pile of issues I suppose is that. But I was reminded yesterday that in Ukraine, which operates a completely different equipment supply system to us, if you like, each division or so, often a brigade, has its own line into various factories and various organisations, and they can literally, it's like an Amazon, if you like. You place an order for what you particularly like, and they'll build you a drone based on the order that you want, for example. But you can place the order for the kind of military equipment you want and get it delivered next week or so. So they've got a very strong linkage between the front line and the back line. Now Australia has the tyranny of distance, so that linkage is much more difficult to do. But in the modern world of connectivity and complexity, those are the kind of things that can actually help us and help push stuff forward before before, say, the front line has to order something that then goes back, that is then processed, that gets funded, that all that sort of stuff that goes on before it's actually pushed forward. For the 6 months involved doing that nonsense, you can actually have the frontline units, if you like, requesting stuff direct from the manufacturer. It's a concept in the Anglo-Saxon world. We have a lot of trouble with that one, but it's certainly a concept that works for them, and it's probably worthwhile looking at.
I just wonder though, James, is it be any different? I mean, even in our experience of recent conflict, the Middle East, Afghanistan particularly, there's an action, reaction, counteraction with the enemy all the time. So you're learning in war as well, and the best example of that is the counter-ID fight, right? When we were obviously at all times trying to, with a very agile enemy who continued changing the way they would employ an IED, you were countering it. So introducing ECM, introducing jamming capabilities, changing the way you conduct patrolling, changing the way you might manoeuvre elements with with OPs and oversight, the way you might conduct even basic drills with how you employ your combat engineers. That's always, I think, a cycle of conflict. And I know at Kokoda, for example, we were really outgunned, we were outranged by the Japanese. We didn't have the range with some of our machine guns, like they're getting Vickers up there, etc. So I think it's not unusual, and Ukraine's a great example of that. The way that war has moved, and what now a drone operator can do just by learning on the battlefield and introducing that technology, I think it's actually going to be constant. That is the sort of nature of war. That is constant in that regard.
And to reinforce that point, none of this is really new. We've had other examples in different scales entirely to this, but one of the reports I managed to salvage was the report of the Department of Defence 1914 to 1918, never completed, as the poor fellow who was writing it said, I need to go to France to look at the logistics supply to the AIF there, and he had an unfortunate encounter with a 5.9-inch shell. But that particular report stresses a number of things, and one of the major things I got out of reading it was that train to the circumstances you need and don't overtrain. And Navy has been really bad at this. You want a leading seaman, you train him to that standard, but there are entire mission sets which Navy will have to do in war, but not now, which do not require very much training. For example, putting boom defences across our ports so that unguided underwater drones don't come in and blow the living daylights out of major pieces of critical infrastructure. So it's a very complex issue. I'd say it's wickedly complex because at the same time you've got to train an Aegis operator for an Aegis-capable ship doing cooperative engagement, and that's really tough. And also, of course, an infantryman today is a very different training burden to an infantryman from World War I or World War II or Korea or Vietnam.
Wasn't the first parachute jump by the artillery without any parachute training? Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right,
into NADZAP.
NADZAP, correct.
Indeed.
Yeah. Worked.
That's called learning on the job, isn't it?
I know, there's the best model I'm there looking at. Neil's not giving me the really good look at that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, Peter, you talked about the three courses of action that Australia may need to respond to. So, localised raiding,
Yes.
Yep. So the third one was fielding an army of 200,000 men, 5 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions to meet a major invasion. I think it's really interesting to reflect on the fact that the permanent military force was about 3,000 in 1938, 80,000 militia. Army actually mobilised to 730,000 soldiers, and 400,000 of those served overseas. What are some of the tips on how to do that? Because that's an incredible feat when you think about that. And that critically, that's off a population of just 7 million.
Yeah, so I said before about the maximum number that a society can generate, if you like, about that sort of 20% of the workforce and things there. And it's interesting that during World War One, that generally speaking, in World War One there was no conscription, so it was volunteers only per se. But a different world. And most country towns and communities, they were happy enough if they lost a third of the able-bodied men to the front line, but no more than about a third. 2/3 had to stay behind. They felt that third was doing was doing their bit, if you like. So in sort of any society, there'll be a limit about how many people that you can actually conscript, mobilise, etc. And I think one of the things that they actually did right at the very first, just before the war, bear in mind, the census wasn't particularly good in those days either. So in 1939, very early, the Department of Defence and various organisations ran a census of Australian males. You had to go to the post office and fill out a detailed form about what you did, what your health was, good, bad or indifferent. Most people chose good. Most people did the census, most being 95%, etc. So it was a fairly accurate thing. Now, that lot of filing cabinet files, if you like, allowed the allocation of your workforce. At that stage, it was they were just thinking males, of course. By 1942, they're thinking about why didn't we do this for the women as well, and they had to do one then for females as well. But that allocation of the workforce is important here to get huge numbers like that. You can't have just anybody join up, because especially today, many of our contractors, they're actually the key maintainers supporting the Navy, Army and Air Force. They can't join up for a starter. Many of our reservists are medical professionals running hospitals and things. They can't all vanish off for sort of 5 years because the civilians still expect medical care. And there's a whole lot of occupations like that. So I think that doing that census just before the war was actually a very clever move, so they understood what the workforce was out there, literally down to the individual level. Imagine the job of cataloguing about 1 million returns in these little cards.
We did reintroduce conscription in 1939 too.
And
Universal military conscription.
for 6 weeks training in the militia, etc.
And we kept extending.
Yeah, we did.
And
True.
we allowed them to serve overseas. So it is different than 1940.
Well, I think.
Oh, in that
sorry.
regard, yes.
I was going to say, I think the strength that we've maintained is the training institution, the training establishments, and the ability to expand, right? So you look at, in the presentations, about that core of professional NCOs and officers, but, your ability to expand, and, again, it's not the same scale at all, but in the mid-2000s, we had 4 concurrent operations occurring within the ADF, Solomon Islands, Timor again, Afghanistan and Iraq. We grew battalions. We were able to expand the training base because we had the nucleus being maintained, and that's where we sent our best people as instructors. So I think the key there is ensuring that you've got the ability to expand from those training establishments, maintain that skill set, that professional level of education, and ensure that you can distribute that, you can disperse that training, but you keep the core elements alive. Don't shrink on actually who you're putting into those organisations.
Just 3 short points to reinforce those. First, in 1939, the entire mass personnel training system built in 1914-15 was still there. The people who ran that system were still there. So we had a mechanism, structure, and the infrastructure, training grounds, barracks, whatnot, to actually train massive numbers of men very, 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 very quickly. second, in the event of any future major conflict on that same sort of scale, conscription in this country will be required immediately, in particular conscription of women. In 1942 in Britain, women were subject to conscription. By the second half of that year, 16-year-old girls were getting their notices and saying, yep, you're leaving school and you're reporting to that munitions factory in Scotland or whatever. And thirdly, that national census, if you will, that's just the equivalent in personnel and personnel skill terms of a national industrial audit. It's just a national human resources audit. So again, that's another thing that needs to be done probably yesterday.
Interestingly, in Estonia, you look at the Baltic states and what they're facing from a threat from Russia. School kids are taught to use drones in primary school. Now it's couched on, it's not couched on warfighting, but that's exactly what it is. It's about training a nation who's quite small with a very big threat. How do you actually maximise the population you have? And that training begins really early. So you've got very proficient kids learning how to fly these things, if they ever needed to, in an operational sense. Yeah.
Interesting. We're nearly at the end of the panel discussion, but I'll throw it open to questions from the floor. But yes, Nick. Nick, there's a microphone over there.
I know, but this is for the recording.
Okay.
Okay, I've enjoyed this, but I'm a bit frustrated. By February 1942, we were spending more on our defence each fortnight than we spent annually in 1938. Right? I think the height of GDP spending on defence during the war was about 43–44%. We learned lots and lots of lessons, and we forgot them pretty soon after the war, and from the mid-1980s we forgot a lot of them in the Department of Defence. When we were all young people in the department, perhaps not Jason, the department had 22,000 people working in defence factories as late as the late 1980s. And they all got privatised, some successfully, some not. My key question is it's all very good, and I agree with nearly everything all the speakers have said, but why do we keep forgetting? Now, I'll propose something to you, and I'd be interested in the comment, particularly from our two speakers. Most of these problems emerged after the Tang reforms in 1973. There was a lot of good stuff in Tang and a lot of very bad stuff, but one of the worst stuff was that instead of having a Department of Supply and 3 service departments, each with a minister and a Minister of Defence, we ended up with a structure with one minister, occasionally you get a few more, trying to run a structure. But the real problem is they're a customer for advice from the department. Whereas from World War II until the Tang so-called reforms, each of the Department of Supply and each of the services are run by a statutory board. In the Navy, the Minister chaired the board, and they were involved right from the start. So from the moment you start talking about developing a capability or developing the industry to support it, the ministers were involved because they had to be. And they were involved right from the start. And John Gordon, for example, a very poor Minister of Defence, was regarded as the most successful Minister of the Navy in the country's history, and I think Mark would agree with me. The problem you've got now, though, is we've got a ministerial supervision structure from the minister down that causes all these things to be forgotten. And, Mark talked about Essington Lewis being given enormous powers. Part of that survived in the Department of Supply to very late in the day, and we threw it away. Now, I'd be interested in your views on whether the reason we keep forgetting all these things and we keep making the same mistakes is because our overall structure of running how we think it and how we task it and how we plan it is no longer run by ministers in Parliament. It's run by huge bureaucratic machines in both the government and private industry. And that's why we keep making the same mistake over and over again, except next time it's going to be a lot more serious.
It was
Why aren't the ministers?
Go first.
Okay, I'll jump into that one first.
Why isn't Parliament and the ministers in control anymore? And is that the cause of the problem?
Okay, it is a cause of the problem. This is one of these complex problems. There's some really good work been done at ADFA over the last 20 years on a thing called the problems of times of deep peace. Because when you're in a time of deep peace, you have no threat. When you have no threat, you don't really have to do your job because it's not going to have any consequences at the political level. So that's a major driver of the Tang reforms, for example, because by that time, we're in times of deep peace. What's the threat from the USSR to Australia in that era? Negligible. So we can now start to play political games and improve all that bureaucratic stuff. Secondly, we seem to forget constantly that working by committees is never a good idea because the definition of a committee is a life form with 6 or more legs and no brain. And I've worked enough with the senior defence committees to see how things just get glued all the time and there's just no progress, or it's way too slow, it's way too glacial. Another thing is risk aversion. We work in an extremely risk-averse society. We didn't used to be like this.
One point, Mark, is to be institutional.
Yes. Now all of those things have been institutionalised within a bureaucratic structure, and a bureaucracy's main aim in life is its own self-perpetuation, even if it doesn't produce anything. So it's a complex series of problems, a bit of a Gordian knot, and I have no idea how to untie a Gordian knot. To my knowledge, there is only one proven way of meeting the issue of a Gordian knot, and that's with Alexander's sword, and cutting the damn thing. And I'd point to some countries which have done that, in particular, for example, Argentina.
Yeah, it's probably just that Australians have developed this particular form to an art form, you know. So we're clearly world leaders in procrastination. However, a bit more seriously. So it is interesting reading Andrew Ross that. So in the interwar period, we had this very strong munitions supply board here, and the 3 services and 3 services reported to their individual ministers, and the MSB reported to the Minister of Defence as well, the 2 ministers as well. But Shedden, what was Shedden's first name? Frederick. So Frederick Shedden goes overseas to the Imperial War, to the Staff College, and learns all about the British system. He comes back and he convinces the minister of the day in early 1939, and the services were supporting him, that this large munition supply organisation should be broken up, and the services should have their own supply organisation within themselves. And Shedden's ambition was the Department of Defence that had just been created was to coordinate everything. And he was focused upon coordination of policy rather than actually doing anything. And that was a particular problem because there were lots of committees formed and they all spoke amongst each other. But he was fascinated by policy, not by implementation. And of course, later we get to the neoliberal world of the 1990s, where that's actually considered the norm, policy implementation being separated. But what broke it there was that the war starts, and I mentioned that business about the orders and sort of all this sort of stuff like that, and the furor of that went on. And basically nothing was done between September and the fall of France. And the fall of France is Dunkirk and losing most of the British Army equipment. The Battle of Britain, things are looking a bit grim here. And the fall of France actually motivates Menzies to cut the Gordian knot. And he appoints Essington Lewis and recreates effectively the munitions supply board. Why did Essington Lewis recreate this? Because he'd been working with them previously and knew they had some good ideas, but they were hornswoggled by sort of all this comment about policy. And it was that era, or 18 months lost, if you like, of focusing on policy by people who didn't understand about lead times and production rates and keeping production lines going. So I think it's that gap between actually doing stuff and talking about stuff, if you like. And the Department of Defence, in my experience, since at least the early 1990s, does like talking about things, does like policy, but the implementation, actually getting stuff in the field, is quite a different order of magnitude. It's completely disconnected. So you've got if you like, the Canberra bubble and you've got the rest of the ADF. And from my experience, the rest of the ADF's having a jolly nice time. They're having lots of fun flying aircraft and driving ships and wandering around tanks. But it's quite divorced from the people in Canberra. So I agree with you. It's good in not time. It's the fall of France time. This needs to be streamlined. You know, the 19 3-stars. This really is a bit too many. You know.
Don't go too early on that one.
Except one. So the Deputy Chief of the Swedish Air Force spoke at the Air Power Conference on Tuesday, and someone asked him a very similar question to that. What's the most important thing that you've learned in the last 3 years of getting serious, because the Russians are obviously just over there? He said the most important thing was to get rid of all these extra headquarters and committees, and he said in the Air Force, everything, acquisition, supply, the whole 9 yards is under the Chief of Air Force. It's an extremely streamlined, rather flat management structure. But he said it's actually making things happen. Gordian knot time.
Yeah, but he's accountable to the Minister directly.
Yes.
My name's Andrew Phelan. I'm a Chinese background. I've been speaking in the media publicly about what I call the China challenge. My question to you, gentlemen, is how important do you think that this becomes a national conversation around the dinner table, in pubs, at work, and so on? And I use the example of a year ago we had a planned flotilla circumnavigate our country. Seemed to catch the Prime Minister flat-footed. It was very awkward. Around Christmas time, the Defence Minister identified a similar planned group off the Philippines, and it emerged last month in Senate estimates where Admiral Hammond was asked about this, that they came within 6 or 7 nautical miles of our exclusive economic zone. That was not made public. What is your take on that, and how important do you think it is that this become a national conversation?
Over to you, Mark.
I think it's absolutely critical. Take a look at history, take a look at where we were in the 1930s, where the strategic threat was. It's from the same general geographic location, it's on the same axis, it's a bit further away, but it's actually far deeper. One of my favourite little games when presenting at conferences, especially overseas, is to spot the Uniting Front people there. And how many suborned, if there's 6 Chinese academics, there'll be 6 suborned academics. You know that's not their fault, they don't have a choice, and there's one Uniting Front guy, and I always bait them, and they respond very predictably. So that's the degree of penetration. And we've got to look at that. If you take a look, and I'll mention it in the next address I give, Ross Babbage's excellent 2 volumes from 2019 on Chinese hybrid warfare. We have been under attack, deliberate formal attack from the People's Republic of China for 30 years. It's about time we recognised it. And I don't mean military attack. I'll go through what hybrid warfare is in that presentation for those who stay here. But the last little tiny bit is the kinetic bit where you're shooting at people. 95% of it is influence, it's cultural operations. I've worked out in the Pacific with the federal police as there's the degree of takeover there, where the Chinese government works hand in glove with Chinese transnational organised crime to take over the economies of the island states.
Just for the record, Mark, I'm the sole Australian to be arrested in his own home as a result of my public commentary on this issue.
Oh, okay. I'm not. That's rather a dubious sort of claim to honour.
It really is. Yeah.
Maybe I'm about to become the second. But yeah, it does need to become a very common topic of conversation because we face a major strategic threat. End of story.
I suppose you also have to bear in mind, Australia's never fought, if you like, a great power by itself. It's always been with an ally. And nations normally, middle powers like Australia normally don't fight great power nations and survive. Ukraine's a bit of an exception here. It's historically fascinating. So it sort of while it's a threat and that's all good, we sort of do need to be sort of cognizant of our own abilities, if you like. But I think that you're right. It is up to the government to mobilise the population in that particular regard. But of course the government, this government, last government, previous government, or name sort of every government back for the last sort of 40 years, or last 30 years, is aware that China is important to many Australians from a financial point of view. You know, and the iron ore magnates of Western Australia would be very disappointed at us having this conversation. So the government has to do, the government of whichever party of whichever day has to do a balancing act between, if you like, that hybrid war, Great War. The Great War brings up our American security alliance, and the financial interdependence between us and the Chinese, and it's a balancing act. And at the moment, of course, there are some concerns by some people about this other side over here, about the US alliance as well. So we don't want to burn our bridges here. If the future could turn out well, but the future may not turn out well. So we need to be careful and hedge and have a few capabilities here, whereby we can still keep the farm, if you like. We don't want to lose Australia. So I think it's a difficult balance. It's a difficult balancing at the present time. But I agree that the government has to, if you like, lead the conversation. At the moment, it's clearly not interested in doing that, it's hiding probably both from the Chinese and from the other side as well.
Could I make one little final tiny comment there? Welcome to the strategic structure, shape and environment of the 1880s. We've been here before.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for the great discussion. We covered. I think we're out of time for questions.
We are.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Can I ask you all to join with me in thanking Mark Bailey, Jason Blane and Peter Layton, steered by James Ealing, for a really, really impressive plenary session that rounded off this evening. After this, there will be a short break. The bar will be open. Snacks will be served, and for those who would like to stay for the networking presentation starting at 7:30 p.m, you're more than welcome. Please can we just find out who those people are. But can you join with me now in closing the seminar and thanking everybody on stage.
Thanks, mate.
While you've read the previous forward, I'm sure that you're